My guest today is Professor Enrique Neblett, who is Professor of Health Behavior and Health Education at the University of Michigan School of Public Health. His research examines the link between racism and health in African American population. Welcome, Enrique.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. I want to start with one of your older papers from 2016 that sort of set the context for our discussion. So future directions in research on racism-related stress and ethnic protective factors for Black youth. So you say research on racism-related stress and ethnic protective factors represent an important enterprise for optimizing the mental health of African American and other racial and ethnic minority youth. However, there has been a relative dearth of work, you say, on these factors in the clinical psychology research literature, and more work is needed in outlets such as these. So, racism-related stress in ethnic protective factors of Black youth. Um, I mean, I don't know much about this, Enrique, but anybody who has witnessed last 10, 15, 20 years will understand this. I would imagine this intuitively, just without any sort of research. And so what do you find in this article? What is the data that you're using, and what are the conclusions that you're making here?
Yeah, thanks for that question. This paper actually wasn't one in which we used any data, actually. It was more kind of a recommendations paper. And at the time, I wrote it with one of my former students, Sean Jones. We were just, kind of lamenting the fact that the research in this area, particularly in clinical psychology journals, had been really limited. There were some fields of psychology like developmental psychology that did a little bit better in terms of, thinking about the development and some of the challenges that Black youth faced. But clinical psychology journals, probably in part due to the history of the field of clinical psychology, didn't have as much attention devoted to kind of understanding the race-related experiences of Black youth. And so in this paper, we wanted to think about, as we move the field forward, and as you alluded to, some of the things that were happening at the time, how could we, kind of address some of the things that Black youth in particular were facing at the time.
Yeah, so Enrique, I'm a big fan of sort of initial conditions, which is, I believe, is not well appreciated. So when we measure outcomes, initial conditions matter a lot, right? So, we had a recent president who said, I was given just a few $1 million, and look what I have accomplished. If you give a few $1 million to a lot of people, they will accomplish a lot, actually. But we don't have that luxury. But more importantly, if you are sort of stressed, you say it's racism-related stress, it has long-term implications for health, for economics, for societal aspects. So it's a huge thing, isn't it? I mean, it's not well appreciated, I think. That's what you're saying in this paper, I think.
Yeah, no, racial discrimination, which is the primary form of racism-related stress that we've examined in our work, has been found in a number of studies, including meta-analytic studies, to be related to any negative mental health outcome you can think of. There's probably been a study showing that increase in discrimination experiences is associated with poorer mental health outcomes. And that's even when you account for, sort of general levels of stress. A lot of the studies initially were kind of cross-sectional studies. And we know that even when you look at it across time, you tend to find these increases in poor mental health over time. So that's, certainly a troubling finding. But the thing is that mental health is involved in almost everything that we do. And it's related to the work we do. It's related to our ability to concentrate and to function. So if these types of stressful experiences that people are having is limiting their ability to be productive or to, sort of focus, that's going to have implications for who's finishing high school. It's going to have implications for your ability to, sort of maintain your job, ability to achieve higher education, which we know has implications for broader health outcomes. So it's all, as you alluded to, kind of interconnected.
It's interconnected. It's also, I do some work, Enrique, in the AI area for primary care and behavioral health. And one of my pet peeves have always been that behavioral health and physical health are very related. And so, and I don't believe the payers, insurance companies, even CMS, I would say, understand it really well. If you have behavioral health issues, it's going to show up in physical health at some
Absolutely.
future point in time.
Absolutely.
And so the larger sort of economic question is, how do you manage that, right? I mean, we're spending 4.5 trillion or something like that in healthcare costs. And so really looking at initial conditions, really looking at how the young people are growing up has huge implications for society, right?
Absolutely, it does. And, for a long time, still in this area, a lot of the studies just kind of focus on one time period and not looking at things from a developmental perspective. And as we like to point out to folks, these aren't, health taking a turn for the worse. These are things that start even before a child is born, for example. They can be mediated by the health environment of the intrauterine environment, mom's health. If mom is stressed out, that has implications for genetic expression or expression of genes, those sorts of things. So what you may have seen in a number of the papers that I shared with you is a real push to have a more developmental perspective. I alluded to drawing on kind of developmental health. And all that means is just this idea that, if we want to understand why there are these disparities later on, why people are dying earlier, why their health outcomes are poor later on, we've got to start understanding, I focus on adolescence, but even by the time you get to adolescence, recent research is showing that things are already starting to, kind of, worsen. So I think that perspective is important.
It's hugely important. And it is hugely important from an economic perspective. And this is what policymakers don't seem to really understand, right? So, it's very troublesome. We send a bunch of idiots to Washington. They don't seem to really understand what's happening in society. Anyway, I mean, I want to go too much into it. So I want to go into another paper. So you say OC symptoms, these obsessive compulsive symptoms. And I knew nothing about this, Enrique. I found this fascinating. So OC symptoms in African American young adults, the association between racial discrimination, racial identity, and obsessive compulsive symptoms. You say all the studies illustrate the role of racial discrimination as a risk factor for increased psychiatric symptoms for African American young adults. None has explored the link between racial discrimination and obsessive compulsive symptoms within such a sample. And so you have some sort of kind of a study here. So this is sort of eye-opening for me. OC symptoms is not something that you typically think about connected with racial discrimination, but we are finding robust data here, right?
Yeah, so most of the studies that look at, the most common psychological outcome people tend to pay attention to would be things like depression and anxiety symptoms. OCD, depending on who you talk to, is linked with anxiety disorder, linked with anxiety, and so This paper, again, was led by one of my former students, Dr. Henry Willis, who had studied OC symptoms and was interested in saying, look, well, we always look at depression, we always look at general anxiety symptoms, but could this also apply specifically to this set of symptoms in terms of thinking, these sort of obsessive thoughts or compulsions that people engage in to kind of relieve some of the stress that's associated with these kind of intrusive thoughts that people have sometimes. And in this paper, we found that there was a link depending on what type of racial identity you endorsed.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. So obsessive compulsive symptoms may be sort of a proxy for, I don't know this, Enrique, could be a proxy for sort of long-term psychological or psychiatric issues for a population. And so if you're picking this up early, is it possible, I don't know if you can find this from the data, is it possible that we can pick up sort of OC symptoms early in a population that is sort of stressed out because of all the issues, discrimination, identity, and all that stuff that you talk about here?
Yeah, there hasn't been a lot of work in the racial discrimination context, at least looking at, kind of early signs or early factors that sort of warn us what could happen later. So, there is a movement within the mental health field to try to identify things that kind of cut across different, kinds of experiences that might serve as biomarkers or indicators that someone may be at increased risk. But that hasn't been done, and that wasn't done in our research. Again, we were trying to understand how do discrimination experiences lead to increases in OC symptoms over time, and to what extent does how you define yourself as African American either speed that along or protect you. And one of the reasons we looked at this is because in general, racial identity, when an individual says being Black is really important part of who I am, there are countless numbers of studies that show that tends to be a protective factor. It will kind of attenuate or mitigate the impact of racism on negative psychological outcomes. In this study, we actually found the opposite of what we expected. So if you read the paper, when we looked at racial identity, we used a profile analysis. We didn't just look at, one specific aspect of identity. We didn't say you have high identity or low identity. We looked at a number of different dimensions of racial identity. And to our surprise, what we found is that the kind of race-focused racial identity profile, so these were individuals who said being Black is really important to my identity. I feel proud to be Black. Those individuals actually had a stronger association between discrimination and increases in OC symptoms. So in most research, people who have a strong sense of identity, people who feel positively about being Black, tend to show the most favorable mental health outcomes. And in this paper, we actually were a little taken back when we found that the folks who actually had the best outcomes were folks who didn't have strong, sort of feelings about being African American, if you will.
Oh, wow. Yeah. This is so fascinating, Enrique. So, I mean, it has applications in other groups in the U.S. too. I would imagine immigrants from various countries and so on and so forth. And I know that this paper didn't get into it, but what is your sort of gut feel about? So, I mean, we are a multi-ethnic, multi-diverse country, and we have groups of people here, who sort of subscribe to those things. What does your gut feel about people who sort of strongly subscribe to a culture or an identity? Um, in other words, the results here sort of is it generalizable across ethnic minorities?
Well, that's a great question. One of the interesting things about this particular finding is that when you look at racial identity in African Americans, again, there's a strong body of research that tends to find racial identity is a protective factor. It protects you against negative racial discrimination experiences, so on and so forth. When we found this kind of counterintuitive finding that it was actually increasing OC symptoms, we did some digging in the literature, and one of the things we found is that when you look at certain other groups, and I don't remember which ones, but I want to say there's certain studies looking at Latinx populations and also Asian American populations, you can find a handful of papers that find the same exact thing, actually. So whereas it was kind of a newer surprise finding for African Americans, and that's where I focus most of my work, so I was surprised. But when I went to the literature, I found that for some groups, this had been found in other groups, and it's not surprising in other groups. So, I think there may be differences across race and ethnic groups. There's been kind of a debate about, how protective is it? When is it protective? Under what conditions? Some people have suggested with you're probably familiar with the Hispanic immigrant health paradox, that it may be, immigrants have better health initially because they're in these kind of ethnic enclaves where they're, eating certain foods, they've got the social support, and then the longer they're in the US, things start to go in a different direction. But this seems to suggest that there is some protective, or resilience sort of conferred by having this sort of strong sense of belonging and connectedness to your group. At the same time, the findings also suggest that there are cases when that's not always the case. And so we're still trying to, sort of parse out when that is.
Yeah, it's a beautiful thing. In some sense, I feel like Enrique, there's a sort of binary outcome in the sense that immigrant coming into this country, he or she has sort of two ways to sort of go, right? One is to find solace with your own kind, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Or you say, I'm going to integrate with society and move away from your own kind. In some sense, it's a binary outcome, in my view. I don't know if this is true or I have no data, Enrique. It's sort of a gut reaction to it. And I find some people who feel very comfortable with their own kind, and I find some people who want to just totally integrate and don't have anything to do with their own kind.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I think what you're highlighting here is that binary outcome has some net effect on your personality or your future psychiatric issues, right? Is that
Yeah, it can. We're still kind of learning about it, and it seems like one of the hypotheses we have right now is that it really depends on the context that you're in. So it may be that if you're in a high racially stressful environment, in that situation, it may be beneficial to, sort of, affiliate with other people in your group. There may be a protective affiliation or protective effect. Whereas you may not need to do that in a setting where everyone looks like you and there's not as much discrimination. So we think that the context matters. To your question, or sort of thinking about it in a binary, the research actually suggests that it's not necessarily a binary. So there are lots of different ways to think about identity, and you do have exactly, the kind of two groups you described where people kind of go one way or the other. But these same sort of profile analyses have also revealed that you have some people who actually do both and. So they, they say, look, I want to be part of American culture, but I also think, my host culture, my sort of racial and ethnic group is really important to me. And so they kind of embrace both. And in fact, there's some studies suggesting that the extent to which you kind of embrace both and can kind of go between both worlds may be actually a skill that confers some additional protection as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting, Enrique. So I was talking to the economist from France yesterday. I grew up in India, and countries with high levels of immigration is gives us a lot more data, a lot more interesting data. But there are countries that has very low levels of immigration, like India, for example, but has very high levels of segmentation for a variety of reasons, right? And so your findings here would be very interesting to look at, sort of closed countries, but they have, a caste system or something like that, and how do they behave internally between the classes? In some sense, this is for the US, it's sort of a class system, right? I mean, a famous senator recently remarked, differentiated between African Americans and Americans, which was quite interesting.
That's one word for it.
And so it is sort of putting people in boxes, isn't it? I mean, and then we are trying to figure out if those boxes has some validation. It's painful to think about it, but that's where we are, aren't we?
Yeah. It is painful. I do think there's a lot of nuance here that kind of gets lost. And I would love, most of our work, or all of it actually, has been in the United States. I would love to look at some of these same relationships that we've done in other countries that have, sort of different contexts, because I think they would help us to understand a little bit about how these processes work. We're actually, I'll just mention really quickly, have a research study right now funded by the National Science Foundation, where we're not, in another country, but we're looking at, we've got two universities. The work is being done in partnership with Howard University in Washington, D.C., which, as you know, historically Black college and university. And what we've argued is that how racial identity plays out and the extent to which it's protective depends on the context. So if you're in, obviously it's not the same comparison, but if you think of Howard as kind of like how you're describing India, and then the other studies being done here at University of Michigan, which is a predominantly white context, you might imagine that how identity functions and the effects it has on mental health is going to play out in different ways in the context. And actually, what we've argued, and the reason we did this study, is that one of the reasons you find conflicting or opposite findings is that if you don't take the context into account, that may explain why in one context you find identities, doing great things, and another context it's not. So again, hopefully we'll get to the international studies at some point, but the purpose of this study is to look at how places that have different hierarchical structures or different cultural contexts might kind of change how identity operates.
Yeah, so context makes a big difference, especially from an identity perspective, as you say. So I want to go into a recent paper that you have, The Influence of Internalized Racism on the Relationship Between Discrimination and Anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
So this study, you say, used two waves of data to longitudinally examine whether internalized racism moderated the association between racial discrimination and anxiety symptom distress.
Mm-hmm.
This again, goes back to what we were talking about before, which is all these conditions have long-term effects on society. And so if we don't diagnose it, if we don't understand it, if we don't proactively intervene, it's going to have huge impact downstream, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
Yep.
what do you find here? So you say participants of 157 Black college students attending a predominantly white institution who completed measures of racial discrimination, internalized racism, and psychological distress. So what do you find in the study?
So what we find in this study is that for individuals who have high levels of internalized racism attitudes, it actually exacerbates or worsens the impact of discrimination on their levels of anxiety distress. So just in case, people who are listening may not be familiar with internalized racism, a number of scholars have argued that when you are exposed to constant negative messages about your group, you may actually begin to believe these negative messages, and they, sort of influence how you feel about yourself. They may, actually make you want to change, your identity to be a different group that you perceive to be more favorable. So one particular aspect of internalized racism is having attitudes that endorse changing your appearance, maybe lightening your skin or wearing a different hairstyle that more fits with Eurocentric, standards of beauty. And what we found in this study, we looked at internalized racism in a couple of different ways, but people who had internalized these kind of negative beliefs about being Black, and particularly people who there's a dimension called hair change. So these are people who say, look, we should change our hairstyles. We shouldn't, wear our natural hair. Those folks were, even more vulnerable when they did experience discrimination. Their anxiety distress went, kind of off the chart or through the roof. And so the combination of, sort of this negative beliefs about being African American in the context of actually experiencing discrimination spells a negative mental health picture.
Yeah, so that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So I wonder, so do you see some sort of a policy? Well, I don't know if it's policy, but do you see some sort of intervention here that could be? So is it education? Is it? I know that the first 5 to 10 years, how the kids grow up, have a significant effect for the next 70 years. So do you see some sort of intervention in the 5 to 10 year time period?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think it requires me to take a step back a little bit. One of the things I'm always telling my students is that, and you saw this probably across a number of the papers, is that we often focus our interventions at the kind of individual level. So we, kind of design interventions that help people to kind of talk about their feelings or discrimination, or there's a lot of attention in recent years to kind of implicit bias training and things of that nature. But one of the arguments that we've made is that if you're just kind of operating at that individual level, it doesn't really get at kind of the root, kind of fundamental cause of the issue. And so your question about whether I see an intervention in, 5 or 10 years, there are lots of interventions and things people are trying to do now. The issue is that a lot of them don't focus at kind of the structural level, or they don't focus at higher levels. They're kind of, again, at the level of interpersonal interactions. I love that you asked this question in the context of internalized racism, because the belief is that internalized racism is a byproduct of something we call cultural racism. Cultural racism is this idea that when you turn on your television, when you look at social media, the depictions and representations of Black people are often negative. And so part of the reason people come to internalize these negative beliefs is because of, kind of the negative portrayals of Black people on TV shows, what you see on the nightly news, those kinds of things. And so thinking about it from an intervention perspective, what I would love to see in the next 5 or 10 years are interventions that begin to get in, to intervene at the level of media and at the level of culture. So are there, policies that can sort of play a role in how people are depicted in media? Are there ways that we can actually get at some of the negative representations that we see in community, that we see on billboards, media communications, health communications? Those kinds of things are a very different level of intervention than we currently kind of tend to privilege.
Yeah, so Enrique, I don't know if it's possible, right? No, I think about sort of foundational education question here. So Homo sapiens, 100,000 years, 200,000 years, pick your time span. Suppose I take a sample, a random sample from around the world today of 8 billion people, Sweden, Congo, India, Australia. They have two different samples. From a genetic perspective, we couldn't tell these samples. So what that tells us from a foundational perspective is that there is no genetic difference between the 8 billion people that we have on this planet. But we spend so much time on surface features. It has no meaning. So that's sort of foundational knowledge. It's foundational education. But we don't seem to do that very systematically, right? I mean, do you think that will make a difference? I don't know. I mean, I just asked.
So when you say make a difference, and you're looking at education, so what would be the thing that you're arguing might make a difference?
So I'm saying, suppose we take first graders, and rather than teaching them, basic stuff, we teach them Homo sapien evolution. We went through a bottleneck. There were only 15,000 samples left at some point. And so every human being on this earth is interrelated at 99.5% level. So if that is the first lesson, a first grader learns, I think that could make a difference. I mean, I'm not an educator. I'm just saying, rather than learning physics, chemistry, and biology, maybe what we should teach kids is really Homo sapien evolution.
Well, it's an interesting idea. I find it intriguing. I think one of the things that I always often think about is because I also study racial socialization, which is how we teach, or how do parents talk to their kids about race and how do they learn the things that they learn. Kids are not born thinking about the world one way or the other. So I think your point that education is important plays a role in how we come to operate and treat other people and things of that nature. And so could it be that if we, kind of taught people what you're suggesting, that we could get rid of kind of the unfortunate kinds of ways that the world tries to play out? Part of the challenge is that the adults who have already been, sort of inculcated in that sort of system are still part of the picture. And so how do you get rid of that? So yeah, sure, I like the idea that we can teach kids this, but that would also mean, I think for it to work, the adults themselves would also have to be open-minded and have, kind of this understanding, and they can't by default because they've been socialized in a kind of racist, structure that says here's the hierarchy, here's who's at the top, who's at the bottom. So we'll have to think about how we would do this.
Yeah, so it's always adults who are the problems, Enrique. I'm very optimistic about the next generation. I'm very pessimistic about our generation, I would say, because we are a walking accumulation of biases that we don't seem to be able to get rid of. And so I hope that when our generation checks out, maybe things get better.
It's tough. Here's part of the issue. The issue is that the beliefs and attitudes are getting passed down through generations. So, you would think that after one generation kind of dies out, we'll be in better shape. But the problem is it never actually dies out, right? So there's still people who have these unfortunate negative views about, the inferiority of particular groups, and they teach their children that. And so it just kind of perpetuates. So we'd have to figure out a way, how do you kind of get in there and stop that intergenerational transmission? One of the ways that we do that is exactly what you suggested. It's education. Yeah. But we're in a system where, there's great inequality in the types of education, the types of things people learn, the quality of education. There's also, great inequity in who's going to college, where, a lot of college students that I've taught kind of say, look, growing up, I wasn't exposed. I didn't live in a very diverse environment. It wasn't really until I came to college that I started to meet other people and have that kind of experience. Well, again, not everyone's able to go to college. In fact, the majority of people don't go to college, right? So, how do you kind of, education we know seems to be beneficial in terms of challenging these kind of, unfortunate ideas, but, how do you create that opportunity for lots of people?
Yeah. That's really interesting. So, one could argue the 500 or so universities we have in this country, colleges, universities, their remit is not just teaching kids who show up. The remit has to be a broader education of the public. And I don't know if it's really understood. I mean, you can't really, if you're a not-for-profit university, you don't just sit back and educate the 2,000 kids who show up and pay $50,000 a year. I mean, that's beautiful. But that's not good enough. Your remit has to be educating the population. If you're not for profit, that's what you should do.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct on that. And I think another way that we can do it, although it doesn't solve the problem completely, is teaching that as a value in the folks who are, the small number that get here, is, teaching, providing opportunities for folks to partner with, sort of community organizations, and to have learning experiences, so that as they go out and become adults, they value, teaching and sharing their experiences with people who haven't had the opportunity to go to a, elite university or something like that. But I like that idea of thinking about going beyond just the kind of select few to a mission that really values, yeah.
So one thing I worry about, Enrique, is, University of Michigan, top university in the country. Not everybody can get in there. It's really, really difficult to get into the University of Michigan. And so what happens to those who don't get in? I'm not picking on University of Michigan. I'm saying more broadly. Do these universities have an obligation to provide some sort of broad education to the population? Um, I believe so, but I don't know. I don't know what the right mechanism might be, right?
Yeah.
So I think they have to really expand these. I mean, we are so good at education in this university. So the 500 universities we have in this country is superior to any other institution in the world.
Hmm.
But why are we sort of, narrowly focused on the kids who come in? How about the kids who could not get it?
Yeah.
I think that's what we have to ask.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's very important. It reminds me, I think there's a larger kind of systemic structural issue here because, um, why is it that we have the numbers of people that we do who are in poverty, for example? Why do we have people who still don't have enough food to eat in a country where there should be plenty of food, right? It's troubling. The resources are not, um, the folks who need them sometimes aren't getting them, and there are things in place, I think, why that's the case. But what do we do? We've got these great educational systems, but only certain people can access them. How do we make it so that that's not the case? And we also know that, when you look at education, the gaps, in health outcomes, which is what I teach about, is just growing between folks who are college educated and those who, have less than a high school diploma. So it seems like the gap is increasing, and that doesn't bode well for kind of increasing everyone's access to the things that we're talking about here.
So I want to touch on a couple of interesting papers. So very topical. So you say racial residential segregation and economic disparity jointly exacerbate COVID-19 fatality in large American cities. A lot of people have a good intuition for this when you look at sort of even raw data. So you said that disproportionately high rates of both infections and deaths among racial and ethnic minorities, especially Blacks and Hispanics, in the US during the COVID-19 pandemic are consistent with the conclusion that structural inequality can produce lethal consequences. You say, however, the nature of the structural inequality in relation to COVID-19 is poorly understood. You say we hypothesize that two structural features, racial residential segregation and income inequality of metropolitan areas in the United States, have contributed to health compromising conditions, which in turn have increased COVID-19 fatalities. Moreover, that those two features, when combined, may be particularly lethal. So, racial residential segregation and income inequality, those features might be fairly highly correlated, I would imagine, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And so,
Yes, yes, that's correct.
and so when you look at outcomes here in terms of COVID-19, we see a significant relationship between those two things. So, in spite of all of our claims about healthcare, um, sort of available to the masses, it doesn't seem to work that well, right?
No, I mean we just keep doing these patterns just keep emerging time and time again, and we have tons of research showing that health outcomes, are worse in areas that don't have resources or that don't have access to health promotive resources. That's oftentimes the case in places where there's high levels of segregation and high levels of income inequality. But for some peculiar reason, even though we know that residential segregation is problematic and income inequality sort of contributes to this kind of exponential increase, in the rate of cases and deaths, the same pattern, still exists. When people were really surprised in the beginning of the pandemic, when it seemed like there were these disparities, and then every new variant that came out, and these disparities continue to exist. There was kind of an excitement like, oh, we got to do something better. But I hate to say it, I feel like for the next pandemic or whatever comes along, the disparities are still going to be there, and the question is why.
So there's also sort of you alluded to this in your previous papers, which is there is a foundational issue here. Segregation, stress may lead to comorbid conditions that we know COVID-19 fatalities are highly correlated with. So we cannot look at this in windows. We cannot look at this in small slices of data. We have to really look at it more foundationally.
Mm-hmm.
COVID-19, we might get COVID-25, a couple of years from now.
Yeah.
So what have we learned from this? Can we course correct from where we are today?
Yeah, so the answer is not easy here. I think what this paper shows is that some of the things that influence health and health trajectories are these kind of big, sort of, again, structural kinds of issues like segregation, like income inequality. And so for me, what it tells us is we've got to figure out how do we improve upon, how do we address, again, the kind of root cause. What is contributing to segregation? What is contributing to, these kind of increased income inequality? If we can begin to chip away at the factors that contribute to those things, then I think we may be able to make some progress. Part of the reason we're seeing the same pattern over and over again is because we're not doing anything that changes the foundation. And part of the reason this is hard work, when you think about things like segregation, these were things that were legally sanctioned, right? These are things that have a long history over many, many years. So we're not going to be able to just wake up one morning and say, oh, let's stop, mortgage lending discrimination. Let's open up all the prisons, which is another major form of institutional, racism. But what are the factors that are leading to why people are disproportionately incarcerated? What are the reasons that income inequality is the way it is? And until we begin to address those things, we're going to just keep, having the same conversations.
Yeah, so you have to go to the root causes. I think we are, we are a smart country, but we don't. you disagree.
I think they're smart. Well, let me not say that because I'll get myself in trouble. But I'll agree with the overall spirit of your statement. I think there may be a few exceptions, but
no. So we are not able to focus on sort of the, as you say, the root causes of the problem. So we are very good at band-aiding things. There are a lot of people in this country, I believe, who are very good at band-aiding things. But band-aids only work so far, right? So you have to really understand not just the symptoms, but the causes, and then really intervene at the causes, right? And as you say, that is a really difficult thing to do. so I don't know.
It's difficult, and it requires a kind of, I think, determination that I'm not sure we always meet, and that we always rise to the occasion. Sometimes I think folks aren't even aware one of the things that's really striking to me when the pandemic happened and there were these disparities, I would get a lot of calls from physicians, and they would say, "Oh, tell us more about why we're seeing these disparities." And they would say, like, in med school, we don't get a lot of, conversations about social determinants of health or its fundamental causes. They're treating the medical problem. It's the medical model. It's very individual focused. And so if physicians are not attuned to the kind of structural issues, then, how are we going to solve the problem or the issue? I think is worth asking.
Yes, I want to finish up with that particular topic, Enrique. So I don't know if you're on this paper or not, the Clarion Call of the COVID-19 pandemic, how medical education can mitigate racial and ethnic disparities. Mm-hmm. So my daughter is waiting for her residency interview results. So
okay.
So you say public health crises palpably demonstrate how social determinants of health have led to disparate health outcomes. The staggering mortality rates among African Americans, Native Americans, and Latin Americans during the COVID-19 pandemic have revealed how recalcitrant structural inequities can exacerbate disparities and render not just individuals, but whole communities acutely vulnerable. While medical curricula that educate students about disparities are vital in rousing awareness, you say it's experience that's most likely to instill passion for change. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think we learn about other groups and experiences that are different from ours by putting ourselves in situations where we're with people who are different from us and who've had different experiences. So we kind of talk in this paper about how, kind of the old model is kind of one of, well, it's not old for some people, but cultural competence, where you're kind of trying to master and learn everything you can about a culture. And in the paper, we kind of talk about this notion of humility or cultural humility instead, which is realizing that you can't ever know everything about a group, but that it's a iterative process where you're kind of learning as you go and figuring things out and learning from other people and acknowledging that you don't have all the answers, you don't have all the knowledge. This particular paper came out of that same, physician who called and said, we don't have a lot of these kinds of conversations in medical training. How can we get there? And so in the paper, we kind of talk about a couple of approaches to improving on the current model.
Yes, it's a three-pillar framework: trust building, structural competency, and cultural humility, as you mentioned. And so, so are you suggesting here, Enrique, that so clearly as you get more experience, you know more, you understand better. But are you saying in the education aspect itself, we should be really sort of focusing on these attributes?
Yeah, I mean, it's mind-blowing to me that when the disparities emerged, the racial and ethnic disparities we saw in the early COVID-19, people were really stunned and shocked, that these sorts of things existed. And when those of us who either have lived this experience or studied this, were kind of like, okay, this is not very surprising. This is the same pattern. It's the same pattern you see in just about everything else. So, but again, I'm not exaggerating when I tell you that a lot of physicians, these are folks with MDs, were really puzzled and didn't really understand this and were surprised, that this was the case. So, the structural competency piece is really focusing on education that teaches folks about how the structural factors play a role in how these disparities play out. And some folks just don't have a good, not through any fault of their own, But I think we can do a better job from an educational perspective in making sure that folks understand that it's not just about, blaming the victim or individual behaviors. I mean, it's probably not surprising in a medical model that focuses at the individual level that you're going to, attribute, someone's negative outcomes to the foods they're eating or they're smoking, that sort of thing. But we got to think about, why are they smoking? Why are they eating bad foods? What do they have access to? This seems so obvious to people in public health, but and others as well. But it's not obvious to a lot of people, and that's really concerning.
Yeah, so if you never live through it, it's not so obvious. COVID-19 really broke this up in some sense. So, you think about comorbid conditions, you think about diet, you think about stress, you think about your economic profile, and we can really see how those things sort of compound to the high fatality rate that we saw in COVID-19 in some parts of the society, right? So your point here, Enrique, is that, yeah, a fresh MD, my daughter's one of them, does she really understand what is behind the screen, so to speak? It's not patient comes in, you measure all the things and you say, this is what you have to do. But what's more important is to figure out what happened last 20 years.
Exactly.
That patient, right?
Yep. What happened in the last 20 years, and what is the environment that person is returning to after they leave the physician's office? I mean, if you give them a treatment regimen or ask them to, exercise or do something, but their environment or built environment doesn't allow that to happen, or it's really hard, or it's not a safe neighborhood, or things of that nature, then it's going to be hard to exercise. If they don't have a grocery store that serves nutritious food in their neighborhood, then we can say, oh, folks aren't eating, they're not eating the right foods, but do they have access? So I think that those things, we're very fortunate. We have, I teach in the undergraduate public health program here at Michigan. But not all universities, it's my understanding, I'm still fairly new to public health, have this kind of program at the undergraduate level. A lot of my undergrad students are future physicians, which is great, but at universities that don't have an undergraduate program in public health, how are those folks who are going to be future physicians getting the information about the kind of structural determinants of health? Is an important question.
Yeah, it's a really important question. It has a lot of policy implications. It has a lot of economic implications. I mean, this might be another podcast, Enrique. So what's the highest return activities for society? I would argue it's actually feeding the population healthy. It's keeping the population healthy. These are the two really important high return activity for society. But we spend very little in either one of these things, right? So neither does, I don't know about the Scandinavian countries. I don't know about the more advanced societies. I haven't really studied them, but in the US, we don't really focus on them. And then we will spend millions and billions and trillions of dollars later in band-aid policies, right? So that is what we have been doing.
Yeah.
I think it's quite inefficient, at least on the side.
I mean, it is. We spend money. I mean, the amount of money that is spent locking people up, incarceration, that money, there have been analyses showing that we know it's not that simple, but if you were to invest more dollars in education, that would be a better investment than the amount of money that we pour into some of these things that are not rehabilitative. And that are even more expensive when you do sort of a cost analysis. So I agree. We need to think about where we put the dollars, but the fact that we don't do that suggests to me that there's something more, I don't know if nefarious is the right word, but something else is going on here. You and I can clearly identify, we can clearly see that if you put dollars here, it might lead to better health outcomes, to be better for society, better productivity, less disability, etc. But why aren't we doing that? There, you know, we see that disparities exist. There's tons of research documenting that disparities exist. We even know some of the reasons that it exists, but the willpower or something, this nefarious thing that I'm saying, we're not addressing, even though we know there's a problem and we know there's root factors. So what are we doing about it? I don't know.
Yeah, it's a good sort of philosophical question. So excellent, Enrique. This has been great. Thanks so much for spending time with me.
Yeah, thanks. I enjoyed our conversation. This was a lot of fun. Maybe I'll come back someday.
Thank you.